terrifying things to see in war. War reveals the darkest aspects of human existence, with scenes of suffering and devastation that linger in our collective consciousness. Throughout history, war has showcased the depths of human cruelty and the toll of violence and its long-lasting effects on the psyche. Although every part of war could be deemed a horrifying sight, from civilian experiences to soldiers, certain occasions add an even worse layer of horror as people suffer through the most unimaginable things other human beings are capable of inflicting. Napalm, the Vietnam War. Napalm is a horrifying jellied substance that sticks to its victims like glue, burning through flesh, blood, and bone. While napalm's first documented military use as an air raid bomb was toward the end of World War II in 1944 and during the Korean War, it really found its horrific stride during Vietnam. The consequences of the use of napalm were so disturbing that the United Nations actually banned its use on civilian targets in 1980 at the UN Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. In papers, shocking images emerged of innocent men, women, and children burnt and dying from napalm's horrendous effects. Napalm B, the type used in Vietnam, was easy to make, even referred to as bathtub chemistry, and Dow Chemical won the bid laid out by the Pentagon in 1965 to become the U.S.'s sole supplier. By 1966, they were using it as a key weapon in Vietnam. It's estimated that in that year alone, 4,500 tons were dropped monthly across Indochina. At its peak in 1968, that monthly total was increased to a massive 5,900 tons, continuing to be used in earnest until 1973. In total, it was a 91.6% increase in the amount used during the 3 years of the Korean War. Described in one news report as a continuous sheet of flames half a mile wide, the incoming onslaught of these jelly bombs was a sight made from nightmares. Seeing its aftermath was no better. A now famous photo depicted the horror and tragedy napalm caused. A young girl running with other children, her face captured in a scream and her clothes completely burnt away. Incredibly, unlike many others, the girl in the photo, Kim Phuc Phan Thi, survived and went on to write the harrowing tale of her experiences with napalm. Napalm scorched my clothing, and then my skin, and then the fat and muscle and other tissue that had once thrived in layers below my skin. That because I would and forever be seen as different. The main reason napalm was so effective was because it stuck, burning and unrelenting to everything it touched, including human skin. And water would do nothing to douse the flames. In fact, it partially combusts oxygen, so trying to relieve the burning caused by napalm could actually cause it to ignite all over again. Many died from exposure, the blast effect or respiratory failure caused by the substance, with others living in agony covered in burns until multi-organ failure would take them away. From seeing the dreaded flames of napalm raining down to the horrors of watching its aftermath, it remains one of the worst weapons in history because of the utter unimaginable pain and inhuman devastation it causes. Medieval biological warfare. Way back in medieval times, a popular... This segment is supposed to be on medieval biological warfare, but the details here are so intense that we can't upload them to YouTube without the risk of having this video age restricted. The reality of creating history content on YouTube is that a lot of what we put out ends up getting censored or demonetized, so we've posted this whole entire chapter of the video to Patreon. If you sign up with the link in the description, not only are you going to be able to watch this whole section uncensored, but you'll also be supporting our mission to teach the world about history. So please sign up with the link in the pinned comment. History is epic. Watch it uncensored. Hill 303. Many atrocities occurred during the Korean War that raged from 1950 to 1953. After the North Korean People's Army attacked the South without warning, they committed a series of war crimes that are considered some of the worst in recorded history. One of which was what occurred on Hill 303 in August of 1950. Under pressure from the advancing Korean troops, a U.S. squad found themselves waiting for reinforcements to help them defend a point not far from Hill 303. When Americans saw a group of soldiers appear, they thought that help had arrived, until they realized that these Korean soldiers were not allies and were in fact heavily armed Red troops. Quickly, they lost control of the situation, and the lieutenant in charge of the squad gave the order for the U.S. soldiers to surrender. This should have meant that they became prisoners of war. Initially, that was how things seemed, given water, cigarettes, and extremely minimal rations of an apple for multiple men to share. Their lot wasn't good, but there was nothing to suggest that these Korean Red troops had more sinister objectives in mind. That is, until they heard nearby U.S. mortar fire. Forcing their prisoners to take off their shoes, they bound each soldier with their hands behind their backs, marching toward Naktong. We only know what happened next because of the accounts of a few brave survivors. PFC Roy Manring was only 18 years old when he was forced into a ditch next to his squad mates, hands still tied. As the Reds stood over them, they raised their burp guns and mercilessly shot to kill the defenseless, surrendered soldiers. As Manring saw the others fall, he was saved by his quick thinking and intense bravery. After being shot in the leg, he was forced to lie under the body of a fallen comrade, smearing blood on his face to make himself look as though he too had been successfully gunned down. Manring reported hearing the footsteps as the Red troops came back along the line, indiscriminately shooting among the corpses to ensure no one was left alive. Despite being hit again by a bullet, this time in the arm, Manring managed to not cry out, a move that probably saved his life. But seeing comrades shot in cold blood and then forced to lie among their remains is one of the most horrific sights and experiences anyone could have in war. Manring was just lucky he lived to tell the tale. And he wasn't the only one. In the end, 4 soldiers survived the ordeal, although each surely had to deal with the aftermath of their experience and the horrifying sights that happened on Hill 303. Perhaps it's inevitable that human beings will always look for ways to cause each other harm and trauma, at least in the case of serious war and conflict. However, there are some moments that stand out as the worst in human history, for the depths of their depravity and the long-lasting effects on those who had to witness the horrific outcomes. Jewish death marches, World War II. By the summer of 1944, it became pretty clear to the Germans that their chances of winning World War II were extremely slim. And when they did lose, one horrific fact of the regime would be laid bare for the world to see: the concentration camps of the Holocaust. While there were many horrific and inhumane sights waiting for the liberators of the camps, one of the final injustices against Jewish people in Nazi-occupied countries was observed by many who could never forget what they saw: the death marches. Although death marches had occurred earlier on in World War II, in 1944 the number hugely increased, leading to thousands upon thousands of tragic deaths. After the Soviets took over the concentration camp Lublin, Heinrich Himmler ordered all concentration camp members outside Germany to be marched towards the interior of the Reich. The marches themselves were composed of Jewish people, prisoners of war, and enemies of Nazi Germany. From Himmler's perspective, there were 3 reasons to evacuate the camps and begin this approach. 1. He and other SS members didn't want the world to know their story, the horrors they had seen and suffered at the hands of the most vicious and devoted of Nazis. 2. They still believed they could be useful in producing armaments for the war effort. 3. They were convinced they could use them as a bargaining chip against the Allies to ensure the survival of Nazism after the war. While on paper, this may seem better than a concentration camp, the reality was horrific. Thousands were forced into walking further than was really possible, under unbearable conditions and abuse from their Nazi torturers. When they removed the prisoners of the Stutthof camp, for example, 7,000 Jewish people were forced to march for 10 days. In total, in just the 2 months of March and April in 1945, 250,000 out of 700,000 concentration camp prisoners were forced on death marches. A lucky few escaped the death marches, and one man in particular escaped twice. 18-year-old Dave Hirsch dragged through 2 separate death marches and lived to tell the tale. Those who survived to tell the tale have since shared their tragic stories of the horrors they witnessed. Denied food and water, the elderly, incapable, or injured fell behind and were brutally shot in front of their fellow marchers. We walked for days, I'll never forget it. The ravines and gutters were all red from blood. We saw people being shot in the front of the chest, in the back. There were people lying on top of hills, in trees. It was really like a war zone. On some marches, as many as 1 in 4 died. In others, like Stutthof, it was even worse. Of the 7,000 that started that death march, few survived. Those who lived through the treacherous journey were murdered when they reached the Baltic Sea. The atomic bomb. One of the most horrifying sights in war is shared by military and civilian alike. Seeing a dreaded canister fall out of the bottom of a bomber plane, knowing the inevitable will happen when it strikes the ground. This is doubly true for those individuals who were unlucky enough to be in Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th, 1945, when the US dropped the atomic bombs on Japanese civilians, a decision that is still viewed as highly controversial today. In fact, 56% of Americans asked in 2015 said they still thought the bombing was justified, in comparison to only 14% of Japanese people. The intention of the drop was in no small part a revenge ploy by the US for the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, but officially it was to save the lives of citizens of America and Japan by forcing a quick end to the war. Survivors of the attack have spoken extensively about their experience, what they saw when the bomb hit, and the tragedy of what happened next. One man, Tsutomu Yamaguchi, was unlucky enough to be caught up in both bombings, having escaped Hiroshima only to be in Nagasaki when the second bomb hit. In his only British interview years later, he described a huge mushroom-shaped pillar of fire rising high into the sky. But the common description remained the same in the moments after the bombs fell, a blinding white magnesium light. Of course, for the survivors, that moment of confusion that accompanied the light wasn't the worst part of being in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It was the aftermath. Chaos, panic, debris, and destruction, people injured and dying as they tried to make sense of what had just happened, something that had never happened before in the whole of human history. A nuclear weapon had been dropped on civilian cities, and the ramifications of it would reverberate for decades to come. In the immediate aftermath, the sights were visceral and haunting. The burned and dying with skin literally peeling away, begging for water. Those poisoned by the radiation, sick, blistered, and dying in the street. Children and babies murdered in an instant by the impact. It was estimated up to 200,000 died from the bombs, and over the ensuing decades, thousands more experienced terminal illnesses like cancer as a result of their proximity to the bombing. As bodies floated down the rivers and survivors picked their way through the destroyed areas of the city, they may have thought the worst was over, but they had more yet to endure. In the following years, many more died from the long-term effects of radiation poisoning and other health issues. In Hiroshima, over 70% of buildings were leveled, and in Nagasaki, its estimated temperatures when the bomb fell reached 4,000 degrees centigrade, literally burning people's eyes from their sockets as they died. To this day, survivors and their children campaign to ensure something like this never happens again. Cavalry charges. Soldiers in war see many unspeakable horrors, from comrades dying next to them in foxholes to the traumatic sights of those affected by mustard gas, trench foot, and other common wartime ailments. But there's something particularly captivatingly horrible about being borne down upon by legions of men on horseback. Cavalry charges have been used in war since antiquity and surprisingly continued during World War II. But instead of facing down infantrymen who would stand with spears and shields or cannons and slow-loading singular guns, they instead faced legions of machine guns and mortars capable of tearing them and their mounts to shreds. It may not have felt as horrifying to those soldiers facing down the cavalry charge, but in earlier centuries, infantrymen would have felt the same way. Despite cannon fire and muskets, the famous poem Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson surmised how it felt to face down these cavalry members. flashed all their sabers bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabering the gunners there, charging an army while all the world wondered. Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem is such a landmark in literary history that it's inspired multiple other pieces of media, including an Iron Maiden song, The Trooper. This refers to the infamous battle of the British against Russian forces in the Crimea War and the tactical failure of the commanders in organizing the attack. But while many of the men may not have survived the assault, the sight of them all charging at breakneck speed toward the firing line must have been an awe-inspiring sight.